you can say this, but he looked me in the eye and he said, "That was good. No bullshit."
Nothing about that night was meant to end this way. A Christmas party, a family argument, a quiet drive home. Then, by morning, Rob Reiner and his wife were found dead inside a house where no one forced their way in. But what's most disturbing isn't only that their own son became the prime suspect, it's what the death reports revealed: the timing, the injuries, and the evidence left behind. What forensics uncovered has left even the strongest hearts in shock. The final hours of Rob's life. Late on the evening of December 13th, 2025, Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, were last seen alive. They had attended a Christmas party hosted by Conan O'Brien, a routine holiday gathering among friends and colleagues. But nothing would prepare the world for the tragic events that would follow soon after. After returning home to their Brentwood residence, Rob Reiner got on a call with Eric Idle. The two spoke about future work, including plans connected to Spinal Tap 2. It was a forward-looking discussion, professional, engaged, and entirely ordinary. There was no sign this would be Rob's last night, or that danger was anywhere near him. Sadly, sometime in the early morning hours of December 14th, both Rob and Michelle were killed inside their home. The Los Angeles District Attorney later confirmed that the deaths occurred before dawn, roughly 12 hours before the bodies were discovered. While the exact time of death cannot be pinned down to the minute, investigators are confident the killings happened during the quiet early hours of the morning. At approximately 3 p.m. on December 14th, the couple was found deceased inside the Brentwood mansion. The discovery came after concern was raised when they failed to keep a scheduled appointment. When first responders arrived, both were pronounced dead at the scene. But what they found immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Police reported no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows were intact. Nothing appeared broken or tampered with. This detail suggested that whoever committed the attack was either allowed inside or already had access to the home. And so, from the beginning, investigators were not looking at a random intruder scenario. Another equally striking detail at the crime scene was the absence of noise. Neighbors later told police they heard no alarms, no shouting, and no disturbances during the night. In a neighborhood where sound carries and security systems are common, this silence was unusual. Whatever happened inside the house unfolded without drawing attention from outside. Investigators also noted that the layout of the residence would be familiar to someone close to the family. Movement through the home could be done quietly and efficiently by someone who knew where rooms were located and how the space flowed. The medical examiner later ruled both deaths homicides, confirming that Rob and Michelle suffered multiple sharp force injuries. This was not an accident or a medical emergency. It was a deliberate act of violence carried out inside their own home. Within hours of the discovery, attention turned to the Reiner's youngest son, Nick Reiner. That same day, police located him and took him into custody without incident. He was later charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in connection with the deaths of his parents. But at this stage, investigators had a quiet crime scene. No forced entry, no outside disturbance, and a suspect with direct access to the home. What remained unclear was what happened after the killings, where Nick went, what he did, and how investigators traced his movements in the hours that followed. Movements after the incident. In the hours immediately following the killings, Nick Reiner did not remain at the Brentwood home. According to investigators, he left the residence shortly after the attack. By 4 a.m. on December 14th, he arrived at Pierside Hotel, several miles from his parents' house. The timing placed him on the move while the city was still largely asleep. Hotel staff later told police that the check-in raised no alarms. Nick interacted normally with employees, spoke calmly, and completed the process without drawing attention to himself. There were no visible signs of distress, panic, or urgency. He did not ask unusual questions or request special accommodations. To anyone watching, it appeared to be an ordinary early morning arrival. However, what was discovered later inside the room told a very different story. When investigators examined the space after Nick had checked out, they found blood inside the room, directly linking him to the violence at the Brentwood home. The presence of blood transformed the hotel stay from a routine stop into a key piece of physical evidence. It established a clear trail away from the crime scene rather than a clean break. But Nick did not stay long at the hotel. He left within hours of checking in. There was no attempt to settle, no extended rest, or indication that he intended to remain there. The brief stay showed how temporary and unsettled his movements were. While Nick was away from the house, the crime itself finally came to light. Romy Reiner, the couple's daughter, lived across the street from her parents. When she became concerned and went to check on them, she discovered their bodies inside the home. She immediately placed the emergency call. Paramedics and officers from the Los Angeles Police Department responded quickly. Upon arrival, they confirmed both Rob and Michelle were deceased. The home was secured, and the scene was formally classified as a homicide investigation. From that point forward, access to the property was restricted, and detectives began reconstructing what had happened inside during the early morning hours. As the investigation expanded, police began tracking Nick's movements across the city. Surveillance footage placed him at a gas station near Exposition Boulevard and Vermont Avenue later that day. The video showed him walking into the store, purchasing a drink, and leaving without hesitation. Again, what stood out was how normal the interaction appeared. Nick wore jeans, sneakers, and a baseball cap. He did not rush, appear disoriented, or try to avoid cameras or staff. The footage showed a man going through a routine errand, despite the gravity of what investigators now believed had taken place hours earlier. By the evening of December 14th, police had narrowed in on his location. At approximately 9:15 p.m., officers arrested Nick near Exposition Park, close to the University of Southern California campus. The arrest unfolded at a busy intersection, drawing attention as multiple police vehicles surrounded the area. Video from the scene captured the moment clearly. Patrol cars blocked traffic, and officers approached cautiously. Despite the dramatic setting, Nick did not resist. He followed instructions and was taken into custody without confrontation. By the end of the night, Nick Reiner was in police custody, and investigators had established a basic timeline: departure from the home, a brief hotel stay, movement through public spaces, and eventual arrest. However, what remained unanswered were the most critical questions: how the attack unfolded inside the house, what weapon was used, and what physical evidence remained behind. Those answers would come next, as forensic teams began examining the crime scene, the hotel room, and everything Nick left in his wake. What forensics found? Once the Brentwood home was secured, forensic teams began the slow, methodical work of reconstructing what happened inside. Their first priority was establishing when Rob and Michelle Reiner died. Without witnesses, and with no immediate digital timestamp tied to the attack, investigators relied on physical indicators observed during examination. The medical examiner analyzed rigor mortis and lividity, two standard post-mortem markers used to estimate time of death. Based on these findings, officials determined that both victims likely died approximately 12 hours before they were discovered, placing the killings in the early morning hours of December 14th. This assessment aligned with investigators' broader timeline and confirmed that the attack occurred while the neighborhood was still quiet and largely asleep. With the time window narrowed, attention turned to the nature of the injuries. Both Rob and Michelle suffered multiple sharp force injuries, a term used by forensic pathologists to describe wounds caused by knives or similarly edged instruments. The injuries were not consistent with an accident or a single strike. They indicated repeated contact with a sharp object. The wounds were also close range. There were no signs suggesting distance or separation between attacker and victims. This was a direct encounter, occurring within arm's reach. For investigators, this detail mattered. Close-range injuries require proximity and physical engagement, which helped shape how they understood the sequence of events inside the home. As the pattern of injuries became clear, investigators began interpreting what the evidence suggested about the attack itself. The presence of repeated wounds pointed toward sustained violence rather than a single impulsive act. This was not a momentary outburst that ended immediately. It unfolded over time, even if that time was brief. Based on these findings, detectives inferred intent. While they were careful not to publicly speculate about motive, the forensic evidence supported the conclusion that the killings were deliberate. The sustained nature of the injuries ruled out an accidental scenario and strengthened the case for a planned or at least purposeful act. These forensic conclusions directly influenced how prosecutors approached the case. Nick Reiner was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree, one for each parent. First-degree carries the highest burden of proof, requiring prosecutors to demonstrate intent and, in many cases, premeditation. Beyond the base charges, prosecutors added special circumstances due to the presence of multiple victims. Under California law, this classification elevates a case into the most serious category the state can pursue. It reflects not only the number of deaths, but also the gravity of the act itself. The inclusion of special circumstances dramatically increases potential penalties. If convicted, Nick Reiner now faces either life imprisonment without the possibility of parole or the death penalty, depending on how the case proceeds and what sentencing options prosecutors ultimately pursue. These are outcomes reserved for only the most severe criminal cases. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office addressed the charge level directly, stating that this was the most serious charge the office can bring. That language was deliberate. It signaled both the strength of the forensic evidence and the weight the prosecution believes the case carries. By this point, investigators had a firm timeline, a clear cause of death, and charges reflecting the severity of the findings. But what remained was the legal battle ahead, and one unexpected decision that would immediately draw attention. Because when Nick Reiner appeared in court, the lawyer standing beside him raised almost as many questions as the charges themselves. The legal turn. As the case moved from investigation to prosecution, attention shifted quickly to the defense, specifically, who would represent Nick Reiner. Within days, it became clear that this would not be a quiet or routine legal strategy. Nick hired Alan Jackson, one of the most recognizable and experienced defense attorneys in California. Jackson is known for taking on high-profile, high-risk cases, particularly those involving homicide and intense public scrutiny. His name alone signals that the defense is preparing for a long and aggressive legal fight. Jackson's resume includes representing Kevin Spacey, Harvey Weinstein, and Karen Reed. These were not simple cases. Each involved complex evidence, media attention, and deeply polarized public opinion. By choosing Jackson, Nick aligned himself with a lawyer accustomed to navigating exactly that kind of pressure. The decision immediately raised questions about cost. Reports estimate that retaining Alan Jackson for a case of this magnitude could exceed $1 million in legal fees, particularly given the possibility of a lengthy trial and capital-level sentencing exposure. For many observers, the question became unavoidable. How was Nick paying for this defense? Public speculation quickly turned toward the Reiner estate. While no official confirmation has been made, legal analysts have noted that estate funds can, in certain circumstances, be used to finance a defense, even when the alleged crime involves family members. Estate law, however, is rarely straightforward. The use of shared or inherited assets can trigger disputes, court oversight, and challenges from other beneficiaries. This possibility has fueled debate beyond the courtroom. Some see the use of family resources as deeply troubling, arguing that assets connected to the victims should not be used to defend the accused. Others believe that access to competent legal representation is a fundamental right, regardless of the circumstances or public outrage. Within the family, the situation appears complicated. Reports suggest that some surviving relatives hope Nick receives psychiatric treatment rather than purely punitive punishment, though no official family statement has confirmed this position. The idea of psychiatric treatment introduces difficult questions. Compassion for mental health struggles and addiction exists alongside the reality of extreme violence. But sympathy does not automatically reduce criminal responsibility, especially in cases involving sustained violence. In fact, addiction-based defenses, while sometimes raised in courts, rarely eliminate criminal intent in homicide cases. Voluntary intoxication, too, does not excuse deliberate acts, especially when forensic evidence points to repeated, purposeful behavior. And for Nick's case, prosecutors have already made it clear that they view the evidence as consistent with premeditation. The prosecution's case relies mainly on physical and circumstantial evidence. A blood-stained hotel room, surveillance footage showing Nick calmly moving through public places, and digital data tracking his movements all support the state's claims. Prosecutors say these pieces fit together to form a clear and deliberate timeline that is hard to explain away. At this point, Alan Jackson's involvement does not guarantee a win, but it does mean nothing will go unchallenged. Every procedure, every piece of evidence, and every constitutional issue will be closely examined. But when Nick Reiner appeared before a judge for the first time, his short hearing revealed more than many expected. Once the courtroom doors opened, the case took an unexpected turn, and the proceedings were suddenly adjourned. First court appearance. Nick Reiner made his first court appearance on December 17, 2025, 3 days after the deaths of his parents. The hearing took place in a Los Angeles courtroom under heightened restrictions, reflecting both the seriousness of the charges and the intense public interest surrounding the case. Nick was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, with the addition of special circumstances. This was the first time the charge was read into the court record. The courtroom itself was tightly controlled. No cameras were allowed inside, and members of the press were required to rely on written notes rather than live coverage. These limitations are not unusual in high-profile homicide cases, especially during early procedural hearings, where courts aim to preserve order and prevent unnecessary spectacle. Nick appeared wearing a harm prevention smock, a standard precaution used during early custody proceedings in serious cases. The garment is not an indicator of guilt or mental diagnosis. It is a routine safety measure applied by jail authorities in certain circumstances. Throughout the hearing, Nick remained mostly silent. When addressed directly by the judge, he spoke only briefly, responding, "Yes, Your Honor," to confirm that he understood his procedural rights. He did not enter a plea, did not address the charges beyond acknowledgement, and did not speak about the events themselves. This restraint was deliberate. Early court appearances are not designed for argument or evidence. They exist to establish charges, confirm representation, and ensure that the defendant understands the legal process ahead. Anything beyond that is typically reserved for later proceedings. Alan Jackson stood beside Nick throughout the hearing. Jackson immediately requested that the arraignment be delayed. The judge granted the request, postponing the arraignment until January 7, 2026. This delay allows the defense time to review evidence, assess forensic reports, and prepare an initial legal strategy before entering any plea. Such delays are common in complex homicide cases, especially those involving extensive forensic material and potential capital sentencing. Observers in the courtroom noted the contrast between the procedural calm of the hearing and the gravity of the accusations. There were no raised voices, no dramatic exchanges, and no visible reactions from Nick. The process moved efficiently, almost mechanically, reinforcing how the legal system treats even the most shocking cases with the same structured formality. Outside the courtroom, public reaction continued to build. The absence of a plea left questions unanswered. The lack of statements from either side preserved silence, where speculation might otherwise rush in. By the end of the hearing, Nick Reiner was remanded back into custody. No bail discussion took place, and no new evidence was introduced. The session ended as quietly as it began, leaving behind a clear timeline but few insights into what had led to this moment. But what the court did not address, and what prosecutors have yet to fully detail, is what happened before the killings. Investigators have acknowledged that an intense argument occurred the night before the tragic incident. This argument may prove central to understanding how the situation escalated and how everything changed. The night before. At some point during the Christmas party, hosted by Conan O'Brien, just a night before Rob's death, the atmosphere suddenly shifted between Rob Reiner and his son, Nick. Witnesses later told investigators that a loud argument broke out between Rob and his son, Nick Reiner. The exchange was far from subtle. Voices were raised. The tension was obvious. People nearby noticed, even if they didn't fully understand what the argument was about. What stood out was not just that there was a disagreement, but how intense it appeared in a public setting. Several guests described Nick's behavior as unsettling. One witness said he was freaking everyone out, a phrase that came up more than once in accounts of the evening. His demeanor reportedly drew attention in a way that made others uncomfortable. This was not a quiet family disagreement happening off to the side. It was visible enough that people remembered it clearly the next day. Rob Reiner, who had spent much of his life in public spaces and high-pressure environments, did not attempt to brush it off. According to those present, he engaged directly, trying to manage the situation rather than ignore it. Michelle remained close by. The interaction suggested not just frustration, but concern, the kind that goes beyond a momentary argument. Eventually, Rob and Michelle left the party together. They did not linger or attempt to smooth things over socially. Their departure was interpreted by some guests as intentional and protective. Rather than staying late, they chose to leave as a unit, signaling a desire to keep the situation contained and to supervise their son away from a public setting. The argument itself did not end unnoticed. Multiple attendees overheard parts of the exchange, giving the confrontation weight beyond private family tension. It became a shared memory among those present, something discussed quietly afterward, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt troubling. Later that night, Rob spoke with friends about what had happened. In those conversations, he reportedly admitted that he was afraid of his son. This was not framed as anger or resentment. It was described as fear, a significant word, especially coming from a father speaking about his own child. That admission would take on enormous significance after the killings. At the time, however, it appeared to reflect a parent struggling with a situation he could not fully control. Rob had navigated decades of professional conflict, creative pressure, and public scrutiny, yet this concern was personal and deeply unsettling. There is no indication that Rob believed violence was imminent. Nothing suggests he contacted authorities or sought emergency intervention that night. What is clear is that he recognized a problem and was troubled by it. Leaving the party early, staying close to Michelle, and voicing fear afterward all point to a heightened level of concern rather than casual disagreement. Investigators later examined this confrontation carefully. While they avoided drawing direct conclusions publicly, the argument provided critical context. It established that tensions existed immediately before the killings and that those tensions were intense enough to alarm others. Importantly, prosecutors have been careful not to overstate the confrontation's role. An argument, even a serious one, does not equate to murder. But in reconstructing timelines and relationships, the events of that evening matter. They form the last publicly observed interaction between Rob and Nick before the attack. The party did not mark the beginning of conflict within the family, but it appears to have been a moment when underlying issues surfaced in a way that could no longer be ignored by those around them. What guests witnessed that night would later be re-examined not as gossip, but as context. As investigators moved forward, they began looking beyond that single confrontation. They turned their attention to longer-term patterns, behavior that predated the party, struggles that had reportedly been ongoing, and issues that family members had quietly dealt with for years. Because behind the argument, behind the fear, and behind the sudden escalation, there was another factor that kept emerging in accounts from those close to Nick Reiner. And that factor, his struggle with addiction, would become central to how many people tried to understand what happened next. Nick's addiction battle. Long before the events that ended in tragedy, Nick Reiner's life had been shaped by addiction. According to those familiar with the family's history, his substance use began in his teenage years. By the age of 15, Nick had already entered rehabilitation, an early signal that what he was dealing with was not experimental or temporary, but serious and escalating. Over time, his substance use deepened, especially with substances known for their intensity, dependency risks, and destructive effects when use becomes chronic. Friends and family members later described a pattern that many addiction specialists recognize: cycles of treatment, hope, relapse, and decline. Each attempt at recovery was met with optimism, followed by disappointment when stability failed to hold. As his addiction worsened, Nick's life became increasingly unstable. During relapses, he experienced periods of homelessness, moving between Maine, New Jersey, and Texas. These were not short trips or lifestyle choices. They reflected a lack of consistent housing, structure, and support during times when addiction had taken control. For a family with resources, these stretches were especially painful. Evidence that money alone could not solve the problem. Evidence that money alone could not solve the problem. Throughout these years, Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner remained deeply involved in Nick's life. They repeatedly funded treatment programs, paid for rehabilitation stays, and worked to keep him connected to care. Their support was not limited to financial assistance. Friends described constant emotional involvement, concern, and a willingness to try again, even after repeated setbacks. Rob Reiner, in particular, did not hide from his son's struggle. Instead of distancing himself, he tried to understand it and, at times, transform it into something constructive. In 2015, Rob collaborated with Nick on the film Being Charlie, a semi-autobiographical story centered on addiction and recovery. The project was directly inspired by Nick's experiences. The film represented more than a professional collaboration. It was an attempt to channel pain into purpose. Rob spoke publicly about the responsibility he felt as a parent and his hope that understanding addiction could lead to healing, not just for Nick, but for others facing similar struggles. At the time, the project was seen as an act of belief that honesty, creativity, and support could interrupt a destructive cycle. For a period, that collaboration appeared to coincide with relative stability. Nick was engaged creatively, connected to his father, and grounded in work that reflected his own experiences. Those close to him described moments where he seemed focused and present. These stretches offered glimpses of what recovery might look like if it held. But stability did not last. Relapse followed, as it had before. Each return to substance use brought renewed instability and distance from any sense of routine. The pattern repeated itself over the years, despite treatment, support, and opportunity. Addiction reasserted itself, often undoing progress that had taken months to build. As time went on, concern among those close to the family grew. Friends noted increasing worry in the years leading up to the tragedy. The cycles were becoming more frequent. The stakes felt higher. What once appeared manageable through intervention and care began to feel unpredictable. While addiction alone does not explain violence, and neither investigators nor prosecutors have claimed that it does, but it forms part of the broader context. It explains why Rob and Michelle remained closely involved. It explains why fear and concern surfaced in private conversations. And it explains why the family continued to intervene, rather than disengage. By the time of the Christmas party, the history was long and complicated. Years of treatment attempts, creative collaboration, relapse, and concern had accumulated. The argument that night did not emerge from nowhere. It was rooted in a history that those closest to Nick had been navigating for more than a decade. In the aftermath of the killings, this history became central to how the public tried to understand what happened. Some saw it as a story of compassion stretched beyond its limits. Others focused on accountability and the need to separate explanation from excuse. What remains clear is that Nick's struggle with addiction was not hidden, sudden, or ignored. It was a known, ongoing battle that shaped family dynamics, decisions, and fears long before the case entered a courtroom. And as the legal process continues, that history will likely remain present in the background, not as a justification, but as part of the human complexity behind a case that defies simple answers. What do you think about Nick's choice of lawyer? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.